Okay, welcome back, economists. We are here to think about how to use our next type of aggregate supply. We have the Keynesian model for aggregate supply behind me here. And when we are using this model, there are four possible outcomes to address, just like there would be with any other form of supply and demand. And that supply can either increase or decrease, or demand can either increase or decrease. It's really important that we only show one of those changes at a time. We do not want to be showing both an increase and a decrease in aggregate supply and demand, let's say, for example, right? Only show one shift at a time. These diagrams are already complicated enough in what they show that diagramming and explaining one shift is difficult enough to do. So let's keep it to one shift at a time, okay? So I'm going to talk you through how to show all four of those changes here. A change in aggregate demand is really not that complicated to show. It's just kind of how we would with any other change of demand with these diagrams, but shifting the supply curve as it currently looks is a little bit tricky to do, so we'll spend a little bit more time on that. But maybe before I talk you through how to do that, it's important to be able to think using this diagram. So we would use this diagram to show a change in the combination of both national output, right, real GDP, and the price level, right? Anytime we have a change in either aggregate demand or aggregate supply, both of those things are going to change, right? So we need to think about what is the change that is moving either aggregate demand or aggregate supply. And if we go through this decision tree that we have here, it should make deciding what to do a lot easier, right? You can kind of get yourself into trouble if you skip through these steps without really thinking about how to go through the process of the decision making here. You might know whether it's an IA or a paper 2 or a paper 1, you might not be able to arrive at the correct answer if you skip these steps here. So the first decision that we need to make is, let's say you are reading an article for your macroeconomics commentary. Let's say you're reading a question and a change has been described, or you even need to show something for a specific prompt on paper 1. You first need to ask yourself the question, is the change that is being described, does that change more so have to do with the consumption of things, right? People buying stuff, or does that more so have to do with the production of things and producers making goods and services, okay? The answer to that question should be pretty clear. Does it more so have to do with buying stuff, or does it more so have to do with making goods and services, right? Obviously, if the answer to the question, is it more about consumption or is it more about production? If it's about consumption, we know that we're shifting our aggregate demand curve, okay? And then once we've made that decision, you should then ask yourself the question, well, if aggregate demand is moving, does the change that is described, is that talking about an increase in consumption or a decrease in consumption, okay? Obviously, we know that we would show an increase in consumption by moving aggregate demand to the right, and the opposite is also true. If we want to show a decrease in consumption, we move aggregate demand to the left. All right? Now, if we've made the decision that the change described more has to do with producing goods and services, we then need to ask ourselves, does that change describe a situation where producers will make more, or will they make less? So, if we ask ourselves that question and we arrive at the conclusion that producers will be increasing production, then we're going to shift aggregate supply to the right. Now, with our aggregate supply curve looking as it does, that's going to be a little trickier than it otherwise would be for a normal supply curve, or even our short-run aggregate supply curve. I'll talk you through that, though. And then if we ask ourselves the question, is production going to increase or decrease, and we arrive at the conclusion that producers will make less, we know we're going to shift our aggregate supply curve to the left, okay? So We know from our Keynesian model here that there are kind of three stages here, right? We have stage one, where if we have an increase or decrease in aggregate demand, in stage one, we'll have a change in output, right? But we will not have a change to the price level, okay? That's because, again, at that level of output, there really is not much scarcity. Factors of production are not scarce. So what you should start this diagram by doing is showing that aggregate demand kind of goes straight through the middle of section 2 here, because we want to be able to show both a change to the price level and a change to output. If you put the aggregate demand curve either here or here, you can only show one of those two things, right? So you'll notice that all of these diagrams, aggregate demand is in the same place. It is right smack in the middle of that sort of middle part of our aggregate supply curve. And that's probably the position where most economies are, right? If you watched our previous video on aggregate supply, you remember that this point where the aggregate supply curve becomes perfectly inelastic, that is the idea of the full output level. Economies are usually, most of the time, a little bit shy of the full output level. So this is a good place to show our aggregate demand curve. Okay, so let's go through the shifts of aggregate demand first. If we've gone through our decision tree over here and we've decided that there's been a change in consumption and that as a result of that change, we will have an overall increase in aggregate demand based on whatever our components of aggregate demand that might be relevant, let's say aggregate demand increases. This could happen for a number of reasons. Okay, aggregate demand 2. Obviously, some arrows are always useful to show that shift, okay? And previously, we had a macroeconomic equilibrium of Y1 and an average price level of 1, right? That is the idea of macroeconomic equilibrium, where aggregate demand and aggregate supply meet. Now, this macroeconomic equilibrium is going to shift. As a result in this change in consumption, we're going to have an increase in output. Producers will make more in response to that increased consumption, but a not so great outcome of that is that we will have inflation, right? So we have positive growth here and inflation here. Now, it's really important that you be able to understand and explain why is it that we have an increase in growth and why is it that we have inflation. In this case, we'll have inflation because we have the same amount of production here, right? Aggregate supply has not changed. We still have the same amount of goods and services available for consumers and governments and businesses to buy, but we have more buying power chasing that same amount of goods and services, right? So we have more demand with the same amount of supply, and the only way that producers will be able to produce more is if they raise their prices. Remember, this does not mean that every single good or service increases in price. This just means that on average, all goods and services went up, right? It's an average measurement. So let's say we have an inflation rate of 2% here. Some goods might have gone up at a rate of greater than 2%. Some goods and services prices may not have changed at all. Others might have been less than that. So pretty simple there, increase in aggregate demand, right? Let's say we have the opposite outcome. Let's say we have kind of a recession situation on our hands. Maybe there's been an increase in taxes. Maybe there's been a pandemic and people are scared. Maybe a war has broken out or something like that. We would have a decrease in aggregate demand for whichever components we're identifying and what our scenario is. And in this case, instead of having inflation, we will actually have the average price level go down. And this is because of the same reasoning here as just a normal supply and demand graph, right? That we producers will need to lower their prices to sell those goods and services because there's less demand, right? The same amount of goods and services, just less buying power chasing those things, okay? So here we have negative growth, probably a recession, and price levels going down. This is a bad outcome. This leads to lower standard of living for everybody, okay? So that covers a shift in aggregate demand, pretty straightforward. Shifting aggregate supply, though, is a little bit trickier. If we've gone through our decision-making process here and we've arrived at the conclusion that there will be an increase in production, we need to take this aggregate supply curve and shift it to the right to show that there's been an increase. Now, that's a little bit tricky to do. Basically, what we're going to do here is we're just going to kind of extend this level 1, this zone 1 of our Keynesian curve, and shift it to the right. Okay? So that would look something like this. So that would be LRAS2. Okay? It's important to make the distinction between short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply, right? If we're using this Keynesian model, we've already made the decision that whatever the change is deals with the long-run determinants of aggregate supply and not the short-run aggregate supply determinants. Okay? So again, same deal here. We had an initial macroeconomic equilibrium here where our aggregate demand curve hit our initial aggregate supply curve. But now we have a new equilibrium where our new aggregate supply curve will lead to an expansion. Okay, there has been an increase in production of goods and services, so there will make sense, there will be an increase in GDP. Okay, but as a result of there being more goods and services available to be bought, we will actually have a decrease in the average price level. Producers will be able to drop their prices for things because whatever has caused this increase in aggregate supply has made life easier for businesses. It is now cheaper for them to produce goods and services, and they can afford to lower their prices, and they will have to do that to get people to continue to buy, right? Because we have the same amount of buying power here, it's just that this amount of buying power is now chasing a greater number of goods and services, okay? So an increase in aggregate supply means that the curve kind of shifts out, shifts to the right, and all that really happens is this zone 1 gets a little bit longer. The proportions of our zone 2 and zone 3 don't really change, okay? So our last outcome here so this outcome's pretty good, actually. We kind of want this. A decrease to the price level is good. It's in this case, it's a healthy form of deflation. Specifically, it would be really good for lower income earners and middle income earners. They are the folks who have the least amount of disposable income. So if prices go down for them, they're the ones that stand to benefit the most, right? And then obviously prices are going down, but we will also have an increase in output, right? As in we'll have more people working, we'll have more incomes and lower prices. That's a pretty substantial increase in just standard of living for those people, right? So our final outcome here is easily the worst of the four. If you find yourself in this situation, if your macroeconomy is in this situation, there's really no good answer about how to fix this one. And that is when we've gone through our decision tree here and we've decided that producers will be producing less, that means that this aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left. And the opposite thing that we did here, zone 1, is just kind of get shorter, right? So maybe we kind of cut it off at about here, and we have a new long-run aggregate supply that shifts to the right. Shifts to the left. And when that happens, we now have less production of goods and services. And so there are fewer goods and services available to buy as a result of whatever our change was, but a fewer amount of goods and services are going to be chased by the same amount of money, basically, right? The same amount of buying power. So that process leads to inflation. And not only do we have the average price level going up, we also have a decrease in output, right? We have fewer goods and services being made. That means less of a demand for labor. So we have fewer people working and the price level going up. That is a recipe for quite a painful situation. There's really not any good option that governments can use to try to deal with this problem. This problem is actually called stagflation, as in when we have a decrease in growth and inflation. So these are the four outcomes, right? It's important to know that there's a change both to the price level and to the output level, and you need to be able to explain both of those things, okay? So this is the Keynesian model. There are circumstances under which you should use the Keynesian model. We covered that in our previous video, and hopefully this decision-making tree here will help you sort out and help you draw this diagram with a little bit more accuracy. If you go through this decision-making process, you will almost certainly come up with the right answer. Okay, so this is how to use the Keynesian model, a pretty useful diagram for really any of our macroeconomics curriculum. Okay, thanks guys.